Welcome, everybody, joining me today on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege. Glad to be bringing you guys more stories and topics around the NFL to start this week. Today, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about what Deion Sanders said in regards to his son, Shedeur Sanders, and his other star player, Travis Hunter, around the NFL draft next year in 2025. We're going to be talking trades with L'Jarius Sneed going to the Tennessee Titans and Hassan Reddick potentially being traded from the Philadelphia Eagles sooner rather than later. And stick around towards the end of the show where I'm going to be giving you guys my reaction to J.J. McCarthy's Pro Day and impressing everybody with his workouts over there at Ann Arbor in Michigan. All of that is coming on today's episode. And before I jump into the first segment, I want to remind you guys, if you have any questions or comments that you want to make throughout today's episode, to please use the tip and donations link at gsmcpodcast.net with any of those questions. It only ensures that I can see your questions pop up here to the right of me in the chat box. I'm able to engage with you guys, maybe have some conversation, and answer some of the questions that you have during today's show. It's a big help for this show as well as all the other shows around the network, and it's always greatly appreciated anytime you guys are able to do that with any questions, comments, or anything you want to say. And in saying that, I'll jump into the first segment, the chip shot story of the day. Starting off with Deion Sanders, starting off with a little college football, some future NFL talents coming into the league around Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. Deion was most recently on the $1 Million Worth of Game podcast, and we've seen, or I've talked about on this show before, how Deion has already made some comments around only his son, Shedeur Sanders, and I took it lightheartedly when he, mentioned that next year how high he's going to be drafted and how he doesn't want his son going and playing in a cold weather city. And I didn't think that was too much to say as a dad, as a player that's had success in the NFL, and Deion being Deion, that's just something you come to expect from him if you follow the NFL and follow college football and know what kind of person Deion Sanders is. But now he's, kind of upped it a little more, including Travis Hunter as well when they asked him, to be fair, the two hosts on the $1 Million Worth of Game podcast, they asked him where he sees Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter going in next year's draft. And Deion Sanders had some questionable or controversial quotes, if you want to say, for his response. He said, "All this is subjective because I know where I kind of want them to go. And let's not forget Shiloh, his other son." And he said, "But I know where I want them to go. There's certain cities where it ain't going to happen. It's going to be in Eli." In reference to Eli Manning back in 2004 when he told the Los Angeles Chargers not to draft him because he felt it wasn't the best situation for him, and he threatened to sit out the whole year if they drafted him anyway. The Chargers drafted him anyway, but they ended up trading him just later that night to the New York Giants, and the rest is history. But with these comments now with Deion, I think it opens up a lot of things to be taken seriously and lighthearted again. Lightheartedly, this is just Deion being Deion again. He's never been shy about saying anything, how he feels, especially in regards to family, his son. He's always going to say how he feels about them. But I think he took it a step further now, and I'm not for or against it. But in this sense, with Deion saying this stuff about both of them, he said before this that they were going to go top 4. He said one of them's going to go first overall and the other one's not going to make it past 4. So he already has those expectations set of him. And on top of saying that he already knows what kind of cities he doesn't want them to play in, how that could raise some question marks for some teams, if they want to always have Deion in their ear somewhat or commenting. It doesn't have to be directly to them. But do they always just want to see it, be asked about it from media, because, you know, media are always going to be asking teams, coaches, GMs about what Deion said if one of these players is drafted there and what they think of what he said. So that, it comes with drafting one of these players. And you have to think, if you're an NFL team, an organization, do you want that on your team? Do you want to take that burden, I guess, for lack of a better words, on with a star player like Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter? Because just watching them this past season in Colorado, I don't think anybody can doubt their talent, how good they are, how good they can be in the NFL. But what these comments do, not only does it, bring a spotlight to them, I think now going into next season with Colorado, you expect them to be better because they tailed off towards the end of last season and they were pretty bad, specifically on offense or on defense. So you expect them to be better. They can't really be worse in that aspect. So people don't really talk about Shedeur and Travis and playing better. They had great seasons individually, but you want to see them now translate that to the team success, as well as still performing their expected outcomes in terms of, touchdowns, yards, and stuff like that. For Travis, how good he does on defense as well, because he plays both sides of the ball. What these comments, I think, does is not only just, like I mentioned, bring that spotlight onto them, but it raises the expectations a little bit for them to perform now, because Deion can say this. He said this a lot about himself, calling his own shots, because he was such a great player, and cashing those checks because he knew that he could write these checks that he could cash because he knew how good he was. I'm not saying he's writing these checks for them because he's not saying anything too outlandish, but it's just sort of upping that pressure, that attention people are now going to have on them because Deion is saying such things about them, limiting them to some teams, and now organizations will be thinking, am I one of those teams? Do I have to worry about that and going through another extra step? And what this ultimately leads me into is this idea I touched on a few weeks ago when I talked about Deion and Caleb Williams not deciding to go to the combine, Malik Neighbors not working out at the combine, and more players taking it upon themselves to make these sort of decisions for them in their best interest. They talked about it on ESPN today, and I think more people are starting to realize this in media and just around the NFL and college football, that because of NIL and because of so much power being brought to these players now, these high-end players, really these generational types of players more so than not, you're going to see more of these instances where players don't have agents, they want to represent themselves, they decide not to go to their pro days like Marvin Harrison, not decide to work out at the combine, only give certain teams their medicals, and really just leverage it more, because more and more with NIL, with these mega deals coming to these young kids so early on, or I should say these young adults, it comes with a responsibility, and it's a good thing because it gives them more responsibility, more able to handle that responsibility early on. But because of that now, they start thinking more on the business side. They start thinking what's best for them. And quite honestly, it translates to other sports as well. If you look at the college basketball for women as well, it was a few seasons ago or last season where Angel Reese said, she's in no rush to be heading into the WNBA because of NIL and because of how financially stable she's already been in college. There's no reason to adhere to some of the things from WNBA teams, from professional teams that think that they have all that these young players would want and want to come to the league right away. It's starting that attention and that want to be in the league because you make big money, you get big contracts, you become financially secure. I think it's starting to lessen now with the introduction of NIL. But I want to stress that this isn't really for everyone. This is only this is only applies to these big players like an Angel Reese, like a Caleb Williams, like a Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter, these sort of big generational type players that garner all this attention, garner all this branding, and teams coming to them for their name, image, and likeness. This only applies to them, but this is really only the tipping point, is what I really want to get at to this whole situation of player empowerment. I'm all for it. I think this is great. but it is a thin line. And I think I was watching ESPN this morning, and Andrew Hawkins actually said it best, I thought, when I was watching. He said that there is a thin line between player empowerment, which is good. I think a lot of people would be for that. But on the other side, it's player entitlement and how negatively that could paint some of these players when they get to the league, in the locker room, their character. It could come off wrong or a bit arrogant sometimes. So there is a thin line to walk there, but positively, if it all works out for these players and they manage it right, I think we're going to start to see more of these instances where these players aren't really in a rush to just be drafted by any organization. They'll really come out with more of these comments like, oh, I want to go here or I want to go here. I don't really want to go there to the Chicago Bears, or I don't really want to go to the Commanders because of so and so. You're going to start to see more people be more outspoken in that way. I think it's great ultimately because the bottom line is, there's only so much time these players have in the league, and being able to play this highly competitive, highly dangerous sport in football, in some cases. So they want, and people should know that they want to get the best out of their career and want to be in the best situation that they think that'll get the best out of them and have a lengthy, prosperous career. And that's really the bottom line in all of this. It makes sense because this is their career, this is their life. They should get a say in what they want to do, especially if money's not really the deciding factor. If that's not really teetering this conversation, then why shouldn't they decide where they want to go? A lot of people now might not like it if it gets ramped up quickly, but like I mentioned before, I don't think it's going to move up that fast in terms of all players now saying this, because it does come with a caveat that you do have to be not only performing, which is the biggest and main thing, performing on the field. That way you gain more attention, more of these brand opportunities and stuff like that. But you have to be able to manage it in the right way where people aren't put off by it, and you don't seem like a jerk, quite honestly, and you don't seem full of yourself. You still remain humble, honed in on keeping the main thing, like a lot of people say in sports. If you teeter that line well, I think this could only go well for players and their careers and getting the most out of it. Sort of like the NBA, that it's now become more, or really almost all about player empowerment, and players looking out for the best interests in themselves. You look at James Harden moving around a lot, Kawhi, Kevin Durant moving around. The NFL hasn't really been there, but more and more with the introduction of NIL, I think it'll become not to the level of the NBA, but very close, because these players, young people, are starting to get more power and responsibility earlier on than they ever have before. And it could be off-putting for a lot of people that aren't used to this, don't really embrace that change. But I think ultimately it's the best thing for these players coming into the league young, managing their own life, what benefits them the most. I think could only end up well. And we're going to see how it all develops going forward. Deion is kind of the catalyst, the start of all of this. And I think more and more you're going to see players and coaches even do more of what Deion, Caleb, and Shedeur Sanders are doing now to start this whole movement now into the NFL. And in saying that, I'll leave it there on that conversation. It's very interesting to see how it'll develop, but it allows me now to move on into the first break of the show. And on the other side, I'm going to be bringing you more trade talks around Hassan Reddick and L'Jarius Sneed, plus later on in the show as well, my reactions to J.J. McCarthy's Pro Day last Friday and how he impressed a bunch of scouts and how it affects his draft stock. So don't go anywhere. All those stories are coming up right after this on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.